The president wanted major cuts and cuts in taxes, and Congress gave the president most of what he requested. Applying supply-side economics, the cuts were supposed to stimulate growth in the economy. Congress gave the president a $750 billion tax cut, the largest in American history. Personal income taxes dropped 25% over 3 years, and the maximum tax rate declined from 70% to 50%. The wealthy and corporations benefited the most from the tax cuts. Reagan succeeded in cutting many of the Great Society programs. Social programs were slashed: urban aid, food stamps, welfare subsidies for the working poor, school lunches, job training, etc. By September 1981, Congress cut over $48 billion from the federal budget, mainly from social programs and increased funds for defense. Federal regulations of business and the environment were cut. James Watt, Secretary of the Interior, believed that resources should be exploited and not conserved, opened up development on public lands to private developers. The Reagan administration opposed health and safety regulations as an unnecessary additional expense for business. Inspections and compliance with government regulations were cut in the expectation that it would provide savings for business and improve American competitiveness in the world market. Reagan economic policies had two major successes in conjunction with the Federal Reserve. Prime rates dropped from 21.5% in 1980 to 10.5% in 1982. Inflation dropped from 12.3% in 1980 to 7% in 1982. However, unemployment refused to follow other economic indicators. Unemployment remained at 8% in October 1981 and 10% in October 1982. 11 million Americans could not find work, and another 7 million could only find part-time work. As late as April 1983, unemployment remained at 10%. Wealthier Americans did especially well, and the top 1% of Americans did the best. The top 20% of taxpayers got a modest 2% increase in wealth. The buying power of the poorest 10% of Americans fell by 10.5% from 1980 to 1985. President Reagan made clear that he would not tolerate strikes by public employees. When 11,500 members of the Air Traffic Controllers Union went out on strike in August 1981, the president fired all the union members. The president's strong stance against unions reverberated throughout the economy, and companies followed the president's lead, resulting in union members falling from 23% of American workers in 1980 to 17% in 1987. The president succeeded in permanently weakening the power and membership of unions in the private and public sectors of the economy. The climate of the 1980s, starting with the PATCO strike of 1981, was government and business would break unions if they could and resist unionization in all segments of the economy and government if possible. Evangelical Protestant groups with a conservative agenda emerged in the 1970s as an increasing percentage of Americans identified themselves as born-again Christians. For many Protestant Americans, the mid-1970s to the mid-1980s represented a new religious reawakening that periodically has appeared in American religious history. By 1978, at least 22% of Americans identified themselves as evangelicals. In 1979, Jerry Falwell, a Baptist clergyman, and Robert Billings created the Moral Majority to re-Christianize America. More secular Americans created the People for the American Way in 1980 to counter it. The Christian right opposed abortion, and the Supreme Court decisions of the early 1960s on prayer and Bible reading in schools. Members of the Moral Majority helped elect Ronald Reagan in 1980 and helped defeat 5 of the 6 liberal Democrats who lost seats in the Senate, giving the Republicans control from 1980 to 1986. President Reagan appointed Christian activists and engaged in symbolic actions to show his support for the moral majority. A number of television evangelists added to the reach of the moral majority, including Oral Roberts, Jimmy Swaggart, and Jim Bakker. Pat Robertson and his 700 Club championed a re-Christianization of America. At the end of the Reagan presidency, Robertson briefly ran for the presidency to succeed the president, but he could not unite the Christian community. Instead, he ended his run for the presidency and backed George Bush in 1988. Robertson created the Christian Coalition in 1989. Local activists won school elections hoping to influence the content of books used in schools and to eliminate the teaching of evolution and sex education. In 1990, the Christian-backed American Center for Law and Justice was established to eliminate the separation between church and state in America and promote a Christian America. The Christian right succeeded in 1984 in persuading Congress to pass the Equal Access Act. Public schools that received federal funds could not deny access to religious groups if they allowed other groups to use school property. In part because of more conservative appointees to the Supreme Court under President Reagan, the Supreme Court in 1990 upheld the act from challenges based on the Establishment Clause. The Supreme Court expanded on the ruling in 1993, requiring schools to give access to religious groups if school districts allowed other groups to use school property after school let out. By 1995, the Supreme Court extended this to colleges and the right of funding for religious groups if non-religious groups received funding. The election of President Reagan and his appointees to the Supreme Court allowed the Christian right to achieve some of its objectives and to develop into an important constituency within the Republican Party.